Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today, in honor of a belated Memorial Day, we are going to be doing a video on debunking the modal ontological argument 6 ways from Sunday again. This is going to be the Memorial Day edition, where we're going to have some respect for a dead and gone modal ontological argument. It just seems that these things come up around holidays. I don't know what it is. Anyway, this is going to be another video responding to a video by Animating Rebel. This is going to be answering objections to the modal perfection argument, is his video. Basically, this is just me responding to way too many videos on my journey to 666 objections to the modal ontological argument. Actually, what we'll be doing is 36 objections in this video, in addition to the other 12 I've offered to Animating Rebels, and the original 66. That brings us up to a total of 114, which is honestly frighteningly close to that 666. It's over a sixth of the way there. Anyway, the modal perfection argument is an argument I did a previous video on objections to, as well as another video kind of outlining the way that the argument works logically. You should check out those videos. What you shouldn't do is check out Animating Rebel's version of the modal perfection argument, because it's just incorrect. It's factually incorrect. It's not a correct representation of what the modal perfection argument is. It's not that I disagree with the video in the way I might disagree with someone about a philosophical point where there's like two sides to the argument. It's just that it doesn't correctly outline the argument. Theists and people who care about the argument and argue for the argument would say, yes, no, you've done a bad job outlining the argument. The argument is quite powerful. Animating Rebel simply does not do it justice. I strongly encourage you not to look at that video. Look at his video responding to my video, because that has some interesting ideas that I'm going to deal with in the second half of this video. The first half, however, I'm going to clear up some apparent misconceptions about the modal perfection argument and make it clear what the argument's doing and definitely what the argument's not doing. So, the first premise that's a little problematic that he has in there is that the negation of the possibility of maximal greatness is impossibility. Never once is the idea of impossibility as a property brought up in the argument. Impossibility is a modal state. And also, it's blatantly false, as we can see in kind of the logical representation of this statement, as best I could do because it's quite vague and doesn't really represent itself well. However, in the best logical interpretation, it's clearly false. It is not identical to impossibility, the negation of possibility of maximal greatness. That's just not the case. So, objection 1 is not what the argument says at all. Just not at all what the argument's talking about. And objection 2, the statement, the claim, the premise is simply false. It's claimed as a definition, but it's actually false, because it's not a definition in any meaningful or interesting way. Premise 2.2, perfections do not entail imperfections. This is a little bit closer to the modal perfection argument, but it's a little bit off. This is an incorrect oversimplification of two premises of the modal perfection argument. These are premise 1, if some property is a perfection, then its negation is not a perfection. And premise 2, if some property f is a perfection, that implies it is necessary that anything that has that property f also has some property g, then g is a perfection. The reason this is problematic is while we can get from premise 1 and premise 2 to premise 2.2, we can't get back. They are in the relationship of being implications. We imply 2.2 from 1 and 2, but they are not equivalent. We can't go back and forth. We can't get to 1 and 2 from 2.2. And 1 and 2 are required for the real argument that I will show here, but I outline in more detail in my videos on the modal perfection argument. So simplifying them to a more kind of palatable position is going to be insufficient to explicate the argument. Objection 3. Not what the argument says. Again. Objection 4. 2.2 is implied by the premises, not equivalent to them. Next up, 2.3. Maximal greatness is the greatest of all perfections and entails nothing but perfection. Once again, not what the argument states. It states that maximal greatness is a perfection, you've got that right, but it's not the greatest perfection at all. Premise 3 is S is a perfection. Being supreme, or having maximal greatness, is a perfection. Pretty simple. Not the greatest perfection, but a perfection. Animating Rebel is also going to claim that this is a definition. Clearly incorrect. Completely incorrect. In the original formulation of the argument, this is not a definition. We do have a definition of what it is to be supreme, or what it is to have maximal greatness. That definition is X is supreme, by definition, if it's not the case that it's possible that there exists a Y such that Y is greater than X, and it's not the case that it's possible that there exists a Y such that it's not the case that X is identical to Y, and it's not the case that X is greater than Y. If you want a more drawn out explanation of what that means, check out my other videos on the modal perfection argument. Point is, there's no claim to perfection at all. If you're saying that 2.3 is the definition of being supreme or having maximal greatness, you are just incorrect. The actual definition doesn't talk about perfection at all. The definition of being supreme has everything to do with being greater than other things and nothing to do with perfection. Objection 5. Not only is this misstated, but it's not offered as a definition. It's offered as a premise that can be objected to. And 2.4, impossibility is imperfection. Nowhere in the entire modal perfection argument does it ever use impossibility as a property. There's an important reason for that. It's not the same argument. It's not even close. There is a difference between modal quantifiers, necessity, possibility, contingency, impossibility, and predicates, is great, is perfect, is supreme. And therefore, treating a modal quantifier as a predicate is simply going to be a category mistake. They're not the same type of thing. One of them is represented by diamonds and squares. The other one is represented by capital letters. They're just different types of things. Objection 6, not at all in the argument. This is completely different. It's a very different argument. So if you think that this is the modal perfection argument, you are wrong. It may be an argument for the existence of God, or the possibility of a maximally great being, but it is not the modal perfection argument. This is a category mistake. Objection 7. Modal quantifiers just aren't predicates. The modal perfection argument doesn't make that mistake, and so it would be a shame to ascribe that mistake to it. The rest supposedly follows from these premises, but there's honestly enough holes in those premises to cause plenty of havoc with the rest of the argument. I don't want to spend too much time and dwell too much on this, and this may be an argument for God's possibility. Doesn't seem to be a terribly good one, but it might be an argument for that. But it is definitely not the modal perfection argument. This is the modal perfection argument. Much more complicated, much more elegant. I would say it's a very interesting and powerful argument. I think it's something that you should look into and study if you're curious about this. You should not take this as the modal perfection argument, because this is a disgrace. Like I said, this is not me objecting to the claims of this argument. This is me pointing out that this is an incorrect interpretation of someone else's argument. And someone else's argument who I don't agree with, but will willingly support that their argument is much better than the thing that was offered here. Okay, with that out of the way, we're going to take a step back and we're going to look at some objections that were offered by Animating Rebel in his other video to my modal perfection argument. These, unlike my first kind of set of objections, are going to be kind of more up to debate and more along the lines of things that sensible people might disagree about. So, first off, Jackson Polluck. The modal perfection argument says that the negation of a perfection cannot be a perfection. I went off and objected that Jackson Pollock and Raphael are negations of each other, but seem to be perfections of beauty, or people would claim they're perfections of beauty. Animating Rebel is going to object that beauty is subjective and therefore cannot be a perfection. Objection number 8. The claim beauty is subjective is not a settled fact, but rather the subject of a fierce debate in the philosophy of art. And objection number 9. The definition used by the modal perfection argument of perfection is something that is better to have than not. Simply because beauty is subjective does not mean it would not be better to have. I doubt you would argue that it would be better to be ugly than beautiful. And were you to take a poll, people would probably say, yes, I would rather be beautiful than ugly. The main objection that I'm going to be kind of pushing forward here is kind of based here. which is that the definition of something that is better to have than not is excessively vague and is really hard to get your hands on. It's vague to the point of the proponents of this argument simply have those properties that they like fall into that category and those properties that they don't not. I need a solid definition before we can really move forward. Anyway, next point is on ataraxia. Negation of perfection cannot be a perfection. Here I'm going to object that omniscience and skeptical ataraxia are negations of each other, but could both be considered perfections. Animating Rebel is going to respond in a couple of ways. First off, ataraxia is not specifically tied to skepticism. It is simply about a relaxed and free mind, and that ataraxia has the potential to become greater. First off, let's be clear. There's a difference between skeptical ataraxia and ataraxia in general. If you read the first line of the Wikipedia page on ataraxia, it will say that it's about having a relaxed and free mind. If you continue deeper or actually study it, you'll learn that skeptical ataraxia is actually a separate thing. It is the state of having no beliefs. It is a perfection in that we cannot have fewer than 0 beliefs. If you show me how we can have negative beliefs, I will be fascinated and I will love to watch your video. Anyway, we have no potential to become greater. We have no potential to have less beliefs. We have reached the limit. So, objection 10, skeptical ataraxia is a very specific state of mind, the state of having no beliefs. And objection 11, skeptical ataraxia has no potential to be greater, as it has reached a limit, just like omniscience is a limit, the limit of having 0 beliefs. The point is that both of these positions are at limits. They are perfections of what they're trying to do. And depending on who you are, one might be preferable to the other. So, how can we objectively say that one is a perfection and the other is not? They seem to both be types of perfections, and they seem to be negations of each other. So we have a problem for the modal perfection argument. Next up, we will look at the same argument presented by me and take a look at the claim about ignorance. So Animating Rebel is going to say that I say that knowing nothing is a good thing because ignorance is bliss. However, something cannot be objectively greater just because it makes us feel good. Seems like a good point, but the claim here is not that having no beliefs is a good thing because ignorance is bliss. It is good to point out that I talk about ignorance and bliss in other parts of my arguments, but not here. It is that all beliefs are unjustified, and so holding any beliefs is simply to have blind faith. Also, you still have yet to answer the question, what makes something better to have? Objection 12, ataraxia is beneficial as it avoids contradictions, not because it makes you happy. And objection 13, we never have offered a reason to prefer one property over another. What makes knowledge greater than ataraxia? What makes one of those two things a perfection and the other not? Still haven't given me a definition. Next up, the law of non-contradiction. This is something that the modal perfection argument, and arguably most arguments, rely on. I say that it in fact implies many contradictions. You should check out my video on doubting truth if you're curious why. Animating Rebel is going to say that if we deny the law of non-contradictions, we can't even make arguments. We'd have to throw out every possible proposition from our ontology and from our claims to knowledge. There's 2 things I want to tell you. First off, the trick to dealing with this is to use something called assumed indirect proofs. The thing that, guess what, the modal perfection argument, when done correctly, actually is a long version of. And if the opponent of the skeptic holds that logic works, the skeptic may assume their position, show that it leads to a contradiction, and then step out of the indirect proof. Also, the other secret is that throwing out every possible proposition is not a problem. It's actually what the skeptic's trying to do. So, objection 14, we can argue without logic by assuming the rules of logic in the first line of an indirect proof. And objection 15, even if we could not actually prove any propositions, this wouldn't be a bad thing. It would mean that the skeptic was right all along. The next argument we're going to look at is about perfection. This is moving on to another claim made by the modal perfection argument. That is the nice long premise 2 that we saw earlier in this video. I ask that we have one example of a perfection implying another perfection. it might help us understand really what perfections are, and it would show that this is an actual property that we should have faith in. It's the kind of property right now that is so logically convoluted that it's really opaque. To demonstrate how opaque it is, Animating Rebel tries to respond by doing something that is not quite an example of it. He says, if I had omniscience, but there was something that I did not know, then I wouldn't have omniscience. The problem here, of course, is this isn't an example of a perfection implying another perfection. This is an example of a perfection implying itself. Note that you've replaced both f and g with the same property, omniscience. We need two different properties for this to be an example of this actually happening. Objection 16. The example is an example of a tautology that everything implies itself. Not the much more controversial premise 2 above. And objection 17, in order to demonstrate this, you must have two different properties. Everything that has the first property must have the second, and the fact that the first is a perfection must require that the second is. If you can give me an example of that, I would be much more likely to assent to your conclusions. However, the problem is that because this is such a convoluted principle, and it needs to be convoluted, otherwise the argument won't work, it's hard for someone to offer a satisfactory example of it. However, one can offer lots of counterexamples, which is what I'm going to do next. So, my counterexample is that sometimes things that are perfections actually imply things that aren't perfections. Having power implies that you will become corrupted. Animating Rebel is going to say that being corrupt is not necessarily a byproduct of having power, and they often happen at the same time, but corruption is a result of choice. And in fact, you can have power and not be corrupt. Honestly, to this, I'll say fair enough. And corruption, honestly, is probably a pretty vague predicate. It's nice for a quick little tagline of power corrupts, but for something more rigorous, let's try this one on for size. So, all people in power are people that must make decisions that someone will dislike. Note that that's my other predicate. Being in power is predicate 1. Having people dislike your decisions is predicate 2. Having power is a perfection. It's better to have power than not. Being a person that makes decisions that everyone likes is better than being a person that makes decisions that someone dislikes. Seems fairly intuitive. Being a person that makes decisions that everyone likes is a perfection. That's just the definition of a perfection. If it's something that's better to have than not, which is what premise 3 shows, then it's a perfection. However, being a person that makes decisions that someone dislikes is also a perfection, from 2.1 and that controversial premise 2 from the modal perfection argument. So it seems that it both is and is not a perfection to make decisions that everyone likes. It's a contradiction from 4 and 5. The point is that power implies a lot of things that aren't perfections. This is one example. There's a lot more if I need offer them and if you're not convinced by this. But it seems that power is going to imply a lot of things that aren't going to be what we consider perfections. Next up, we're going to talk about happiness. We're dealing with the same property, but I have a different objection this time, which is that having knowledge implies that you'll not be happy. Ignorance is bliss and all that stuff. Here is where I bring that argument in. Animating Rebel is going to say, knowledge enhances who you are as a being, happiness does not. Ooh, enhances who you are as a being. I have no idea what that means. It's important to object here that you're claiming that happiness is something that is not better to have. If you're saying that it's not a perfection, then it's something that is not better to have. That's just the definition of a perfection. Beyond this claim going against pretty much anyone's intuition, that being happy is something that is better to have, you've yet to explain what you mean by better to have. If you had given me an explanation, maybe it would be more intuitive. So there's no real way to tell if happiness falls into that category or not. Objection 19, to claim that happiness is not something that is better to have, is to have to bite an enormous bullet that most people aren't going to be willing to stomach. And objection 20, you have to offer an exact definition of what it means for something to be better than something else. Please. Emotions. This is dealing with the same original perfection argument point and my same objection, but Animating Rebel is going to offer a different response. Your emotional state does not contribute to what you are as a being, but your knowledge does. Ooh, we're actually getting somewhere, it feels like. Moving forward on things that are going to be able to be perfections and things that aren't perfections. Contributing to what you are as a being. That's interesting. But let's think about this. If contributing to your state as a being is a criterion for something being a perfection, then power doesn't seem to be a perfection. Does having followers make you a different kind of being? Does just standing in front of a button that sends nuclear missiles make you a different kind of being? It doesn't seem so. But if it doesn't make you a different kind of being to have those powers or have those abilities, then power isn't the kind of thing that makes you a different kind of being. So it's not a kind of thing that can be a perfection. Also, it's important to note that in philosophy, some claim that emotions are actually propositional attitudes, a particular attitude coupled with a specific proposition. Under this view, emotions and knowledge are actually the same kind of thing, as knowledge is simply the attitude of belief or acceptance in regards to some justified true proposition. Interesting. So, objections 21 and 22. If contributing to what you are as a being is a criterion for a perfection, power is not a perfection. And objection 22. Emotions and knowledge are actually the same kind of thing, according to some philosophers. Next up, we need to talk about ontological because it's a poorly defined and strangely used word. So, we are at the same point with the original point and my objection. Animating Rebel is going to say that happiness is not ontologically beneficial, having knowledge is. So, ontologically beneficial simply means better for your existence. We still really haven't defined it any more than that. The Epicureans offered some lovely arguments for the claim that happiness is actually really good for your existence. There's probably some psychologists out there that would offer similar arguments saying that happiness is good for your existence. Do you have any arguments for why knowledge is better than happiness, other than just kind of stating that it is? And once again, do you have a definition of beneficial for your existence, or ontologically beneficial? You've added a word in front of beneficial, but it hasn't really given us any more information. Saying that something is ontologically beneficial tells me nothing more about that thing. Objection 23. There are many arguments for happiness being the most important thing. You do nothing to refute these, or present even an argument for the opposing claim. And you leave undefined and unexplained what makes something ontologically beneficial. Now, talking about Socrates, Animating Rebel says that Socrates' wisdom got him killed socially and politically, but it did not kill him ontologically. No, that's not true. It got him killed ontologically. He stopped existing. That's what it means to be killed ontologically, to stop existing. Ontology is the study of things that exist. Look at the definition of ontological, I think. Or if you mean something else by it, tell me what else you mean by being killed ontologically. I'm fine with you redefining words as long as you actually give me a definition for those words instead of making me kind of figure them out based on how you're arguing about them. Please. Objection 25, to kill something ontologically just means to make it cease to exist. And objection 26, which is kind of a tangent. Socrates never claimed to have wisdom or be wise. The whole point is that he just asks questions. Whether or not he was wise is something that can be gotten into. That one probably can be skimmed over. Next up, suffering. Here I'm going to object to the same property of the modal perfection argument, that existence causes suffering. Existence is claimed to be a perfection, but suffering is not. Therefore, either existence is not a perfection, suffering is a perfection, or P2 is not the case. Animating Rebel, among other things, is going to say that God has reasons for causing us to suffer, and that suffering is in some way justified, morally justified. Well, I'm going to save an objection for this for the finale, because we actually need another piece in order to get there. So, next, we're going to talk about the Trinity for a little bit. We're moving on to a different part of the modal perfection argument, which is the claim that being supreme is a perfection, which is actually a premise, not a definition, as we learned earlier in the video. I claim that being God would make you lonely. Animating Rebel is going to say God's not lonely because he is three other people, and those people are not the same as each other. I will fully admit I don't know that much about the Trinity. However, From my understanding of it, the doctrine of the Trinity breaks a fundamental logical principle known as the transitivity of identity. You can learn about it in my video on identity and my videos on the properties of relations. If A is identical to B and B is identical to C, then C is identical to A. It's one of the properties of the relation of identity. If the Father is identical to God and God is identical to the Son, then the Father is identical to the Son, which, from my understanding, is something that the Trinity doesn't claim. The point is that belief in the Trinity seems to go against a fundamental law of logic. But if you want to better explain the Trinity to me, perhaps, I would be more than willing to listen, because, like I said, it's something that I don't have much understanding about. Next up, talking about loneliness. This is the same objection from me. Animating Rebel is going to offer another response, which is that God is not lonely because he is self-satisfied and self-sufficient. Let me see. The definition of self-sufficient is that he's able to do things on his own. Loneliness comes not from not having someone to do something for you. So this is an insufficient way to satisfy that need. Just because you're self-sufficient doesn't mean you're not lonely. You could be on a desert island and be completely self-sufficient, able to provide whatever you need for yourself, but still be lonely. And according to the dictionary, self-satisfied means a usually smug satisfaction with oneself or one's position or achievements. Smugness doesn't seem to counteract loneliness either. I'd love to see an argument for these claims, or maybe a better definition of self-satisfied or self-sufficient, because perhaps these arguments are strawmans, or these definitions are not what you're talking about. But once again, if you don't give me the definitions of the words that you're using, I have to use the common ones, the ones that most people use. So, having a peer would solve the problem of loneliness, but the point is that God doesn't have a peer, hence the original objection. Objection 28, being self-sufficient doesn't seem to remedy loneliness, and objection 29, being self-satisfied doesn't remedy loneliness either. Next up, responsibility. Being supreme is a perfection, and my objection, being God, would give you infinite responsibility, because you would have infinite power. With great power comes great responsibility, which would not be preferable. Animating Rebel asks the question, who is God responsible to? I'll give you a simple answer. Us. God is responsible to us in how he acts and in how he has created the world. We'll get back to that in our final objection about suffering. Objection 30, though, God would be responsible to us. Very simply. Finally, free will. This is something that's very important moving forward to our finale. Being supreme is a perfection. I said that being God would mean that you don't have free will. Check out the free will dilemma, another video I have if you're curious as to why. Animating Rebel says that God could have free will if we define free will as not being coerced. Now, it's important to note that this is a position on free will being defined as not being coerced. It's known as a compatibilist definition of free will. It's very common and has many great supporters and many arguments for it. However, it is in direct contradiction with something known as libertarianism. The libertarian view of free will is the viewpoint on which Plantinga's free will defense rests. And Plantinga's free will defense is pretty much the only defense that the theist has against the problem of evil. So if you accept this definition of free will, it might be an internally consistent position, but you're going to have to come up with another response to the problem of evil. So objection 31, holding this view on free will destroys the free will defense. If you're willing to go there, be my guest, but a lot of theists are going to be unhappy with you. Happiness part 2. Being God would mean you would not be happy, so being supreme or being God is not a perfection. Animating Rebel is going to say absolute happiness cannot be achieved in a world where people are free. Uh-oh, what did we just talk about? Free will. First off, what do you think absolute happiness looks like? Many would argue that they've experienced happiness in their lifetimes, or absolute happiness in their lifetimes. So claiming that it can't be achieved seems a little counterproductive when people would say that it already has been achieved. The question is this something that is beneficial? I would wager that most have experienced absolute happiness would say yes. We can't judge objectively, as we have yet to say beneficial for what. It seems to me that Those people that have really experienced happiness or absolute happiness would say that it's a good thing to have, would say it's the kind of thing we would prefer to have, would say it's something that we'd want to put in the category of perfections. And also, P.S., if your last point is correct, people are not free in such a way that excludes happiness. God could have just created a world where people always choose the good without coercing them, because we don't have libertarian free will. So, that would be objection 32. Absolute happiness is attainable, has been attained. Objection 33. Absolute happiness is desirable. It's something we would rather have than not. And objection 34. Compatibilist free will does not explain why we are not all happy. It does not solve the problem of evil. Next, we're going to talk about beneficial. This is kind of coming down to one of these central points I've been making on and off through this whole video. Animating Rebel says that we consider things great-making properties because they are ontologically beneficial. Inspiring Philosophy actually has a similar kind of line and kind of explanation for this. But neither Animating Rebel nor Inspiring Philosophy has offered a real definition of the term. They simply assert that some things are ontologically beneficial and some are not, but give no reasons. I see no reason to acknowledge such a vague and fickle term when you haven't given me a criterion for something being ontologically beneficial, other than the things that I want, or the things that God is. Clearly those are circular criterion, or just very biased ones. The point is, it's a vague, it's a fickle term, and it's not something I think anyone should have in their ontology. So, you've never defined the central concept of your argument. If you have a definition, please offer it. I'm worried, though, because you haven't offered a definition, that you don't have one, or that one doesn't exist. Finally, suffering. On to the finale. Suffering is horrible. God has reasons for causing us to suffer? Really? Existence causes suffering. Existence is inherently linked to suffering. The point is that if something has the property of existing, something has the property of suffering. Even if it's not necessary that existence has caused that suffering is inherent to that existence. It is constantly conjoined and correlated with it, which is all that's required for P2. You can't say that God has reasons for causing us to suffer because you've dropped the free will defense. Which means, sure, God has a reason for over 240,000 Afghanistan and Iraq War veterans with PTSD, over 1,500 Afghanistan and Iraq War veterans missing a limb, over 40% of veterans that died at a Phoenix center while awaiting treatment, over 55,000 veterans that are homeless on any given night, over 900,000 veterans that rely on food stamps to eat, over 1 million people that have died fighting for the United States in wars. God has reasons for those things, and they aren't moral reasons, because you don't like free will. If you think God has free will isn't the kind of thing that would preclude a world where those kind of things didn't happen. God has reasons for them, he just won't tell you. It's not a God I want to believe in, or I think anyone should. Happy Memorial Day, everyone. Go thank a veteran, and stay skeptical.